A simple woman boarded a flight one early morning, wearing a worn-out Yale baseball cap and a plain white t-shirt tucked into jeans that had faded from years of honest wear. To most eyes, she was just another middle-aged traveler, the kind who might be visiting a family member or returning from a modest vacation. Yet, within the first few minutes of stepping into the terminal, everything about her presence sparked subtle discomfort among those who thought themselves superior. A sharp-dressed businessman, catching sight of her in the first-class line, lifted an eyebrow so high it nearly disappeared into his neatly combed hair. A flight attendant, clipboard in hand, and a practiced smile frozen on her face, visibly tensed at the sight of the casually dressed woman approaching. The woman, whose name was Judith Winters, moved with the unhurried calm of someone who had endured storms far greater than social judgment. Only 7 days earlier, she had been confirmed as the newest Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, a title not yet inscribed into the minds of the general public, and certainly not into the assumptions of the gate agents and passengers surrounding her now. As she handed over her boarding pass, the gate agent barely glanced up, muttering, "Enjoy your flight, Miss Winters," mispronouncing her name in the process. Judith simply nodded, used to such minor indignities, and made her way down the jet bridge, feeling the thick tension of invisible eyes peeling away layers of her anonymity. Inside the aircraft, the air was cooler, sharper, filled with the sense of pressed leather seats and brewing coffee. First class, though only half full, radiated a kind of exclusionary energy. Men in immaculate suits, women wrapped in tailored coats and silk scarves, everyone seemed to belong to a secret club built on appearance. A club she was unwelcome in, simply because she refused to dress the part. Judith found her seat 3A, a window seat, and slid her weathered leather bag under the seat in front of her rather than place it in the overhead compartment like most first-class travelers. Old habits died hard. For decades, economy class had been her domain. The cramped, chaotic space where she had drafted legal briefs on tray tables and caught snatches of sleep between public defender hearings. First class still felt like visiting a foreign country. The man in the seat beside hers, perfectly groomed, his shoes polished to a mirror, Shine glanced up and, seeing her, immediately looked away, his lips tightening in a thin, displeased line. She offered a soft good morning, but he barely nodded, burying his face behind a financial newspaper whose front page screamed about upcoming Supreme Court appointments. She caught a glimpse of the headline and smiled faintly at the irony. As more passengers filed in, Judith felt the social architecture of the cabin settle like a heavy curtain. Here were the regulars, the venture capitalists, the corporate lawyers, the government consultants who treated first class not as a luxury but as a birthright. And then there was her, the invisible interloper, marked by her frayed cap and the simple gold ring she still wore in memory of her late husband, Thomas. When the lead flight attendant, a blonde woman with a tightly coiled chignon and perfect makeup, arrived offering pre-departure drinks, her mask of professionalism slipped ever so slightly for certain passengers. Her smile warmed, her voice dipped into charming tones. But when she reached Judith, it cooled to polite frost. "Something to drink before takeoff?" she asked. Voice clipped. "Just water, please," Judith replied, matching politeness with politeness. The attendant nodded briskly and returned with a plastic cup of water, not the glass tumbler others had received. A small thing, but not insignificant. Judith had just lifted the cup when she noticed a man across the aisle, watching her with open disdain. His face stirred a vague recognition, but the connection remained elusive. He leaned toward the attendant, whispered something, and both of them threw a quick, furtive glance in her direction. "Everything all right, sir?" the attendant said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Just wondering about the, passenger standards these days," he replied, not bothering to lower his voice. The attendant nodded in understanding, responding with a smirk. "We'll keep an eye on things. Mr. Townsend." Townsend. The name clicked. Richard Townsend, corporate attorney, Senior partner at a firm Judith had ruled against in a major labor rights case 3 years prior when she was still a federal judge. He hadn't recognized her yet, not in the cap, not in the plain clothes, not stripped of robes and titles. The door sealed with a thud. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and the engines began their low, rumbling growl. Judith stared out the window, trying to lose herself in the vastness of the runway beyond. But the eyes of judgment bore into her back like cold steel. 20 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Heather, she had glimpsed the name tag, now began the in-flight service. Her posture stiff but efficient. When she reached Judith's row, she offered the beverage selection without the deference she gave others. "Cranberry juice, please," Judith asked gently. Heather's lips pressed into a flat line. "Specialty juices are reserved for regular first-class travelers," she said coolly, her voice carrying over 2 rows. Richard Townsend chuckled audibly, pretending to offer his drink allocation to her like he was bestowing charity. Heather, playing along, rewarded him with a genuine smile, pouring him a generous scotch while handing Judith a half-filled plastic cup. Judith said nothing, taking the cranberry juice without protest. There were bigger battles in life. She had fought them. She had won them. Yet she noticed, everyone noticed, a young man 2 rows ahead, messy hair and glasses slipping down his nose, was watching everything with a sharp, attentive gaze, not judgmental, analytical, recording, perhaps mentally, every slight, every tone, every twitch of disdain. Judith's seatmate leaned toward her, his voice filled with thinly veiled superiority. First time in first class, she looked at him with a practiced courtroom smile. "No." He blinked, thrown off balance. "Business or pleasure?" he asked. "Pushing. Family," she replied, turning back to her book, a dog-eared paperback mystery novel about a detective who solved crimes no one else could see. "You must have gotten one of those last-minute upgrades," he mused. Across the aisle, Townsend grunted his agreement. "Dilutes the experience, doesn't it?" he said. Addressing no one and everyone, Heather returned with the snack basket, but skipped Judith without pause. When Judith politely raised her hand, Heather's response was sharp and loud. "Ma'am, you'll need to be patient. I'm serving passengers in order." Heads turned. A flush rose on Judith's cheeks, unwanted and humiliating. After everything she had achieved, after every courtroom, every protest she had defended, every laborer whose rights she had fought to protect, here she was, reduced by appearances alone to something less than human. The young man with the glasses glanced around, slid his phone subtly onto his tray table, and, angling it downward, tapped record. Heather passed by again, muttering to another attendant, "Did you see that hat? Looks like she picked it up from a garage sale." The hat. Thomas's hat. It had weathered time and grief alongside her. And somehow, the insult to it stung worse than any to herself. And then, Townsend's phone rang, boldly. He answered it, ignoring the airplane mode requirements. "Yes, Richard Townsend speaking," he said loudly. "I'll be presenting the Westmore brief to the Supreme Court next month. Hopefully this new appointment isn't another academic ivory tower type with no real-world sense." Judith closed her book softly, her heart beat in her chest, steady and sure. The irony rippled through her like an underground current. None of them knew. Yet, the morning sunlight had already begun to bleach the tarmac outside into a dull gray as the plane leveled into cruising altitude. Judith pressed her forehead lightly against the cool window, watching the cloud cover slip beneath them like slow-moving rivers. In the stillness, she allowed herself a rare moment to breathe, to exist not as Justice Winters, not as a headline waiting to be written, but as a sister, a widow, a woman quietly making her way through an unfriendly world. A soft chime echoed overhead. The captain's voice, practiced and vaguely cheerful, announced that the flight attendants would begin full service. Judith listened without truly hearing, her mind already drifting elsewhere, to her sister Margaret's hospital room in Chicago, to the dozens of legal opinions she still needed to finish before her formal investiture, to the life she was leaving behind in order to shoulder a far heavier responsibility. A cart rattled down the aisle. Heather, still radiating the mechanical grace of someone accustomed to pretending to care, reached Judith's row once again. Without a word, she handed a laminated menu to the man beside her and skipped Judith entirely, rolling her cart along as if she did not exist. No apology, no acknowledgement. Judith didn't react. She simply folded her hands in her lap, smoothing the fabric of her jeans, absorbing the slight like countless others she had endured in quieter ways. Over decades, the stain of judgment had a way of bleeding invisibly into every corner of public life. Sometimes it was blatant. Sometimes it was delivered with the casual elegance of those who believed their cruelty was justified by mere appearances. Across the aisle, Richard Townsend's voice floated over, unbidden and smug. "It's not just about who pays for a seat," he said, apparently to no one in particular, but loud enough for Judith to hear. "It's about maintaining certain standards." The man beside Judith chuckled in agreement, shifting slightly to angle his body further away from her, as though her very proximity was offensive. From somewhere behind them, a young child began to cry high, shrill, piercing, but no one turned around. The cabin was too tightly wound in its own silent dramas, its own unspoken hierarchies. For the human needs of a child to matter, Judith closed her eyes briefly. In another life, she might have leaned across the aisle and delivered a withering legal lecture about public accommodations law, about dignity as a constitutional principle. But today she needed to hold on to the simple grace of patience. The young man 2 rows up shifted in his seat again. His phone was face down now, but his eyes remained trained backward, occasionally darting toward Heather and the cluster of flight attendants murmuring in the galley. His expression was tight, jaw clenched in a way that suggested barely contained frustration. He was young enough to be dangerous, the kind of person who, in a different era, might have carried pamphlets into town squares, a sudden jolt turbulence. Nothing serious, but enough to rattle the glasses and elicit a few nervous gasps. Judith instinctively braced herself against the armrest, feeling the cold metal beneath her palm. Townsend glanced up from his tablet, offered a loud, theatrical sigh, and then returned to whatever corporate memorandum he was drafting, probably arguing against some workers' claim for basic rights. She mused. Heather re-emerged, this time bearing a tray laden with meals. Again, her pattern was evident. She delivered meals first to the sharply dressed men, her tone syrupy sweet, her posture deferential. When she finally reached Judith's row, she didn't offer a choice between beef or chicken. She simply placed the last remaining tray on Judith's table with a perfunctory clatter and moved on. The food was cold. Judith set the tray aside. Hunger was a negotiable need. Dignity was not. Minutes dragged into an hour. The young law student she recognized, the casebooks peeking from his backpack, now seemed to reach a decision. Quietly, he rose, stretched as if merely relieving a cramp, and made his way toward the galley, where Heather and another attendant were laughing behind cupped hands. He said something low, urgent. Heather's smile faltered. Her mouth twisted into a sneer just before she turned away from him, dismissing him with a tight shake of her head, returning to his seat. The student caught Judith's gaze and offered the smallest of nods. She returned it imperceptibly, but in that flicker of communication, a silent alliance formed, not between judge and citizen, simply between two human beings who recognized injustice when they saw it. A soft notification pinged on Judith's phone, a rare vibration in airplane mode. Out through because it came via secure government relay. A message from Chief Justice Harrington himself. All is well. Security expresses concern. Confirm upon arrival. H. Judith smiled faintly. The chief, formal and distant at the best of times, had nevertheless taken a paternal interest in the newly appointed justice from the moment of her confirmation. She typed back, "All well. Thank you. We'll update upon landing." The plane banked slightly as it began its slow descent into Chicago airspace. Out the window, the quilted landscape of the Midwest unfurled beneath her gray fields. Clusters of trees not yet green with spring. Industrial towns stitched together by winding rivers. Somewhere below, Margaret was waiting. That was the world that mattered. Heather made one last pass through the cabin. Collecting trash with mechanical efficiency, she paused at Judith's row, hesitated, and then, as if summoning some final burst of grace, leaned down and whispered, "I hope you enjoyed your flight." "Ma'am." Judith met her gaze, held it. "Thank you," she said simply. No retribution, no public shaming. Not yet. The plane touched down with a bone-jarring bump. A ripple of tension broke across the cabin as passengers simultaneously reached for overhead bins and mobile phones. The unwritten social contract of first class dissolved instantly, replaced by the raw self-interest of disembarkation. Judith remained seated, letting the others push past her. Townsend, juggling a briefcase and a $5,000 watch, flashing on his wrist, bulldozed through the aisle without a glance at her. As she rose and reached for her bag, the young law student waited. Lingering near the exit, he caught her eye again and mouthed the word, "respect." The connection startled her more than she cared to admit. The jet bridge was crowded with airline staff, now too many for an ordinary flight. A woman in a navy blazer with a corporate pin intercepted Judith just past the threshold, her face pale but determined. "Justice Winters," she said under her breath, using the title now for the first time. "We are so very sorry. Please, if there's anything we can do to make amends." Judith shook her head. "I'm here to see my sister. That's all." Flashes exploded behind her as journalists who had somehow caught wind of her presence crowded at the gate's perimeter. Someone had leaked it, maybe a fellow passenger, maybe even one of the flight attendants. No matter. The narrative had already begun to spin out of her control. The young man Carter, she would learn later, stood at a respectful distance, phone lowered, waiting, not a predator, not a sycophant, just a witness, and perhaps, someday, an advocate. Judith tucked Thomas's baseball cap more firmly under her arm and strode forward, away from the jet bridge, away from the murmurs and cameras and contrition. She was not here to punish individuals. She was here to challenge assumptions. And sometimes, the best way to wield power was to refuse to wield it at all. The hum of the terminal swallowed Judith Winters as she stepped beyond the jet bridge into the cavernous expanse of Chicago O'Hare Airport. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed against the early afternoon gloom leaking in from tall windows. The air smelled faintly of industrial floor polish and fast food, the scent of transit, of places neither here nor there. Judith adjusted the strap of her leather bag across her shoulder and kept her head low, pulling the brim of Thomas's old Yale cap further down to shield her face. She moved swiftly, hoping to disappear into the crowd, to become just another weary traveler dragging their burdens toward baggage claim. But the currents of attention had already begun to shift. At first, it was subtle, a longer glance here, a hesitant double take there. People scrolling through their phones froze mid-swipe. A few whispered, passing along some half-formed rumor, a name, a title, justice. Judith tightened her grip on the bag and lengthened her stride. It wasn't fear that prickled across her skin. It was the exhaustion of inevitability. She had wanted a simple journey. She had wanted to be invisible. But history, it seemed, was determined to find her. At the end of the terminal, a knot of airline executives waited like penitents before a reluctant priest. Their faces, strained into professional smiles, cracked under the weight of scandal spinning faster than any PR department could contain. Judith recognized the uniform insignia of senior operations managers, regional directors, people who never appeared for a regular arrival unless the situation demanded urgent damage control. The woman who stepped forward wore a navy suit a shade darker than protocol recommended. Her name tag read Eleanor Briggs, Regional Director. "Justice Winters," she began, her voice trembling with a practiced mix of apology and awe. "On behalf of our entire airline, please allow me to extend our deepest apologies for any—" Judith raised a hand, cutting the speech short with a gentle, firm motion. "I'm here to visit my sister," she said. "I don't need apologies. I need a taxi." Eleanor faltered, clearly unsure whether offering assistance would be seen as respectful or intrusive. Judith offered her a thin smile, one perfected over years of judicial restraint, and continued toward the terminal's exit. Behind her, the knot of executives dissolved into frantic motion. Phones buzzed. Orders were barked into radios. Damage assessments and social media monitors kicked into overdrive. Meanwhile, Judith moved through the terminal like a stone dropped into a river, the flow of people bending subtly around her, half recognizing, half doubting. A teenage girl nudged her father and whispered urgently. A young man in business casual fumbled with his phone, pretending not to record. Outside, the chill of Chicago spring slapped her cheeks awake. Wind tore at her coat as she stepped onto the curb, scanning for a taxi. Before she could hail one, a black sedan with government plates slid to a stop beside her. The window lowered, revealing a security agent in a charcoal suit and an earpiece. "Justice Winters," he said. "We've been dispatched to ensure your safe transport." She hesitated. Pride flared a stubborn desire to refuse, to continue her anonymous pilgrimage through the ordinary world. But Margaret's voice echoed in her mind, practical and unyielding. "Don't be foolish, Judy. Accept the help when it's needed." Judith exhaled through her nose and nodded once. The agent stepped out, opened the rear door, and she climbed in without a word. As the car pulled away from the terminal, she caught glimpses of passengers pointing, of phones raised like small, accusing weapons. In the rearview mirror, the agent met her gaze with a flicker of sympathy, not pity, but respect born of long service. The ride to Margaret's apartment passed in relative silence, punctuated only by the muted squawk of radio updates and the occasional vibration of Judith's phone, which she ignored. Outside, the city unrolled itself, brick buildings weathered by decades of wind, neon diners advertising world's best coffee, wide avenues choked with early afternoon traffic. Inside the car, Judith allowed herself to replay the flight in fragments, the disdain in Heather's narrowed eyes, Townsend's sneering voice, the small kindnesses of the young law student who had noticed everything. The emotions were layered in complex anger, certainly, but also sorrow, and a bone-deep fatigue that no title or accolade could erase. The injustice was not new. It had simply been magnified. When they arrived at Margaret's modest building, Judith leaned forward. "Thank you," she said to the agent, and meant it. He inclined his head without speaking. Margaret's apartment was on the third floor, no elevator. Just a stairwell that smelled faintly of old paint and warm bread from the bakery downstairs. Judith climbed steadily, not allowing herself to feel the ache in her knees. At the door, she knocked softly. It swung open almost immediately, revealing her sister's familiar face, thinner than she remembered, but lit with the kind of fierce joy that not even illness could extinguish. "Judy," Margaret cried, pulling her into a hug that smelled of lavender lotion and resilience. Judith allowed herself to be folded into that embrace, to rest her forehead against her sister's shoulder for a long moment. Inside, the apartment was cozy, cluttered with books and knitted blankets. A news broadcast murmured from a muted television, the scrolling ticker at the bottom catching Judith's eye. Supreme Court justice involved in in-flight incident, airline issues, formal apology. Judith sank onto the couch, ignoring the creak of old springs, and looked at Margaret with a rueful smile. "It appears I've made the news." Margaret arched an eyebrow, settling onto the opposite chair with the caution of someone still healing. "You always did have a knack for stirring things up without trying." Judith chuckled softly. "I didn't want a scene. I just wanted to be left alone." Margaret studied her for a long moment, her gaze sharp as ever. "Maybe the world needs scenes like this," she said. "Maybe people need to see that it's not just titles and robes that deserve respect." Judith didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out Thomas's cap, running her fingers over the fraying edges. It was not a symbol of power. It was a symbol of endurance, of choosing compassion over arrogance. Again and again. The muted TV screen shifted images, clips of passengers disembarking, blurry footage from a phone showing a confrontation in first class, Carter's video. It had made it into the world. As all truths eventually did, Margaret picked up the remote and unmuted the volume. An anchor's voice, low and urgent, filled the room. Incident has sparked nationwide conversations about unconscious bias, class discrimination, and how easily appearances can deceive even seasoned professionals. The airline has pledged a full review of its staff during their training procedures, and sources close to the administration confirm that Justice Winters has declined to press formal complaints. Judith listened, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Margaret turned the volume down again and said, "You realize, don't you, that you just became a symbol? I never asked to be a symbol." Judith said quietly, "No one ever does." Margaret replied, "But symbols aren't chosen. They're recognized." They sat in silence for a while, the late afternoon light slanting golden through the window blinds. Outside, the city lived and breathed, indifferent and infinite. Eventually, Margaret smiled, a real, mischievous smile. "So," she said, "are you going to pretend you don't want to see what they're saying online?" Judith groaned, but she reached for her phone anyway. As she scrolled, she saw it all, hashtags blossoming like wildflowers. I had first class, justice, how judged by character, not by clothes. She saw posts from students who said they now saw their professors differently, from workers who shared their own stories of being misjudged. She saw anger, too, and fear, and hope tangled together in the messy, aching way that real change always began. And somewhere, buried in a flood of comments, a simple message caught her eye. "Thank you for reminding us that dignity has nothing to do with appearances." Judith smiled, a small, fierce thing, and closed her phone. Tomorrow, the world would continue. Tomorrow, hearings and cases and opinions would clamor for her attention. But today, she was simply Judith Winters, and that, she decided, was enough. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was painted a dull pewter, clouds heavy with the threat of late spring rain. Judith sat at Margaret's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee she had barely touched. Across from her, Margaret leafed through a thick manila envelope filled with paperwork for physical therapy appointments and insurance forms, pretending not to watch her sister too closely. The world beyond their small apartment was no longer ignoring Judith Winters. Her name was everywhere on television, across news sites, in editorial columns shouting praise or outrage depending on their slant. Talk shows speculated endlessly about what had happened on Flight 1867. Some commentators lauded her grace under pressure. Others questioned why she had been traveling without a security detail, as if her modesty was an affront to protocol. Everywhere she looked, there was noise. Margaret set the paperwork down and reached for the remote, flicking on the television almost apologetically. The volume was low, but the headline at the bottom of the screen screamed, "Justice Winters Incident, Symbol of a Larger Problem." On the screen, a news anchor with impeccably styled hair turned to face the camera, voice solemn. "This morning, the airline at the center of the controversy announced mandatory bias training for all staff and a full investigation into the incident involving Justice Judith Winters." Public outcry continues to grow, with many calling for systemic reforms beyond this single case. Margaret muted the TV again. "They're not going to let this go," she said softly. Judith stared into her coffee, watching the milk swirl like tiny galaxies collapsing inward. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said. "I know," Margaret replied, "but maybe that's why it matters." A sharp knock at the door broke the quiet between them. Judith frowned. No one was expected. Margaret struggled to her feet, waving Judith back when she made a move to help. "I'm not made of glass, you know." When she opened the door, the hallway beyond was crowded. Two suited individuals from the Supreme Court's security details stood at polite attention. But behind them, an entirely different presence waited. Carter Williams, the young law student from the flight, looking nervous but determined, clutching a thick laptop bag against his chest like armor. Judith rose slowly, Heart thudding once in warning, Carter stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Justice Winters," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you. I I thought you should know before it spreads further." Margaret let him in, and Carter entered the apartment like a man stepping into a lion's den. He set his bag carefully on the floor, drew out his laptop, and opened it without preamble. A video was already queued, not just snippets now, not just blurry, shaky footage of whispered insults and sideways glances. It was a full, compiled narrative pieced together from multiple passengers' perspectives, stitched seamlessly into a devastating documentary of casual cruelty and breathtaking prejudice. In one corner of the screen, a time-stamped record ran, verifying authenticity. There were subtitles transcribing every whispered slight, every sneering comment. Close-ups captured the flicker of disdain on Heather's face, the smirk curling at Townsend's lips as he mocked Judith's supposed standards. Carter's voice was tight. "It's gone viral. Over 6 million views overnight. And growing." Judith sank back into her chair, the weight of it settling like a stone on her chest. Part of her wanted to recoil, to retreat, to bury this under the quiet dignity that had carried her through decades of fighting systemic injustice. But another part, the part that remembered every courtroom where a homeless mother was sneered at, every deposition where an injured worker was gaslighted, every clerk who had been overlooked because they did not look the part, that part told her to stay very still, to listen. The video ended with Carter's soft voice narrating a simple, devastating line: "Dignity should never depend on appearances. Justice should never wear a uniform." Judith blinked hard. Margaret, voice raw with pride and sorrow, said, "You can't stop this now, Judy, even if you wanted to." The knock at the door came again, more insistent this time. Margaret exchanged a glance with her sister and then opened the door once more. This time, it wasn't just Carter or the agents. It was a local news team, cameras already rolling, reporters jostling for space in the cramped hallway. "Justice Winters, can you comment on the airline's apology? Do you believe appearance-based bias is systemic? Will you be pursuing legal action against the airline?" The questions came rapid fire. A fusillade of noise and flashing lights. Judith stood, smoothing her clothes, feeling the weight of every invisible gaze upon her. She walked toward the doorway with the slow, steady grace that had earned her the respect of clerks and colleagues alike. Margaret hissed, "You don't owe them anything." Yeah, but Judith shook her head once. It wasn't about owing. She stepped into the threshold, facing the crush of microphones and cameras, and raised her hand for silence. A miracle the reporters fell quiet. Judith's voice was low, measured, but it carried like a bell through the sudden stillness. "I boarded that plane as a sister flying to visit family. I boarded that plane wearing the memories of my life, not the symbols of my office. And I was judged, not for my ideas, not for my work, not even for my actions." She paused, letting the words settle, sharpen. "I was judged for my clothes, for my face, for my seat assignment, for all the things that should never matter in a just society." A ripple ran through the crowd. Some reporters lowered their cameras slightly, as if the gravity of what they were capturing demanded reverence. Judith continued, her voice warming. "I have spent my career believing that dignity is not a luxury, but a right. That much measure of a society is how it treats the invisible, the overlooked, the underestimated." Another pause, a deliberate choice. The way a trial lawyer lets the jury feel the weight of truth. "I will not be filing complaints. I will not be seeking revenge, but I will not be silent either, because this incident is not about me. It is about everyone who has been mistaken for less because they wore the wrong shoes, spoke with the wrong accent, sat in the wrong seat." She looked out across the sea of faces, some ashamed, some angry, some inspired, and she smiled. "I will continue to serve justice, in and out of my robe." With that, she turned, re-entered Margaret's apartment, and closed the door firmly behind her. For a moment, there was silence outside, stunned, heavy, and then the reporters surged back toward their vans, their newsrooms, their feeds. the story already galloping ahead of them into the bloodstream of the nation. Inside, Margaret was crying openly. Carter stood frozen by the kitchen table, looking at her as if he had seen something sacred. Judith wiped her hands on a dish towel and said lightly, "Well, that should keep me busy for a few days." The laughter that followed was strained but real. Later that night, as darkness pooled against the windows, Judith sat alone in the small living room, the city lights glittering far below. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Chief Justice Harrington. "Proud of you. Sleep well. Justice, tomorrow, the real work begins." Judith smiled to herself. Tomorrow would come with new fights, new burdens. But tonight, she had won something quieter, harder, more lasting. Tonight, she had claimed not just the seat at the bench, but her place in the hearts of those who understood that justice was not just a ruling from on high. It was a small woman in a frayed baseball cap, standing her ground at the threshold of history, the morning after Judith's impromptu doorstep speech. Chicago stirred awake not to the sound of traffic or morning radio shows, but to her voice echoing across every major news network. Clips of her calm but blistering words cycled relentlessly on breakfast TV, in social media feeds, even piped into coffee shops where baristas paused mid-pour to watch. For the first time in years, an act of quiet dignity, not outrage, not scandal, had captured a nation's divided attention. At Margaret's kitchen table, Judith sat with a piece of toast she hadn't touched, her phone vibrating ceaselessly beside her. There were messages from friends she hadn't spoken to since law school, from junior clerks offering solidarity, from advocacy groups asking for interviews. Even Carter had texted once, simply writing, "Thank you for your courage." Margaret, bustling awkwardly around with a walker, glanced over and smirked. "You're trending again. Number one, you beat out a pop star's wedding and a senator's meltdown." Judith shook her head in disbelief. "I wanted to be invisible," she murmured. Margaret only laughed, a low, warm sound that filled the small kitchen. "Maybe invisibility was never your real calling." As they spoke, thousands of miles away in corporate boardrooms and law offices, a very different reaction was unfolding. At the headquarters of the airline involved, the scene was frantic. An emergency PR team huddled around laptops, analyzing trending hashtags, viral reposts, influencer reactions. Their CEO, a woman who had weathered industry crises before, looked genuinely shaken as she addressed her executive team. "Our failure is not just operational," she said grimly. "It's cultural. We need to own that before it destroys us." Well, within hours, the airline released a second, stronger public statement, not the usual vague language about regrettable experiences, but a full admission. "We acknowledge that unconscious bias and discrimination played a role in the unacceptable treatment of justice winners, effective immediately. We are launching a comprehensive internal reform initiative." The words were carefully chosen, the tone more somber than defensive. But the damage was already leaking into their stock prices, dipping nearly 8% in early trading. And at one of the country's most prestigious law firms, Townsend and Pike LLP, the atmosphere was even worse. Richard Townsend sat stiffly at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, his hands folded so tightly they blanched white. Across from him, a dozen senior partners studied him as though he were a liability. They were already calculating how to cut loose. The managing partner, a silver-haired man named Elias Pike, spoke first, his voice dangerously quiet. "Richard," he said, "do you have any idea what you've cost us?" Townsend opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. How could he explain that he had insulted a Supreme Court justice? On camera, before millions, you were scheduled to argue Westmore v. American workers before the bench in 2 weeks. Another partner said, "How do you expect us to proceed when one of the justices you mocked personally will hear the case?" Townsend swallowed hard. "I didn't know who she was," he said. "And that," Elias Pike snapped, slamming a hand against the table, "is precisely the problem." There was a long, painful silence. Finally, Elias leaned back, steepling his fingers. Effective immediately. You will take an indefinite leave of absence. You will withdraw from Westmore. And you will issue no public statements without firm approval from our crisis management team. Townsend sat there, breathing heavily, feeling the slow collapse of everything he had built, all undone not by a failed argument, not by a bad case, but by the casual cruelty he had shown when he thought no one important was watching. Meanwhile, in a small house in suburban Ohio, Heather Reynolds, the flight attendant, whose coldness had crystallized the confrontation, watched the news unfold with growing horror. Her union representative had already called that morning, blunt and unyielding. You're on administrative leave pending investigation. Do not speak to reporters. Do not post online. We'll try to negotiate the best exit we can. Heather stared at her reflection in the muted television screen. She had not recognized Judith Winters. She had seen only a woman who didn't belong in first class. A woman who had violated the unspoken codes Heather had internalized without even knowing it. She thought about all the passengers she had slighted over the years, the mothers in leggings, the older men in work boots, the nervous teenagers traveling alone, all the tiny humiliations she had meted out without thinking. And now the whole world had seen it. Heather closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully ordered life crumbling inward. At the same time, in the more rarefied air of Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court itself buzzed with restrained unease, though publicly apolitical. The justices and their clerks could not ignore the firestorm engulfing one of their own. Chief Justice Harrington summoned Judith to a private conference call that afternoon, his voice calm but tinged with unusual warmth. You've handled yourself admirably, he said, more admirably than I might have managed in your place. Judith offered a small smile through the video feed. I didn't plan any of this. No, Harrington agreed, but sometimes history plans for us. There was a beat of silence. Then he added, almost conspiratorially, you've sparked something bigger than you realize. Public discourse on invisible biases, appearance discrimination, equity. He leaned forward slightly. Lean into it. Judith, not as a victim, as a catalyst. Judith's mind flashed briefly to Thomas, to long conversations late at night, where he had argued that real change rarely came from those who sought it, but from those thrust into it unwillingly. I'll consider it, she said simply. After the call ended, she stood by Margaret's window, watching the traffic far below. Horns blared, sirens wailed. Somewhere, a church bell tolled noon. The world, in all its chaotic beauty, carried on, and so would she. That afternoon, another message arrived, this one from Carter. It was an invitation to a student-led panel at Georgetown Law, discussing bias, professionalism, and the future of public service. They wanted her to join remotely, not to lecture, but to share her perspective as someone who had been both underestimated and exalted often in the same breath. Margaret, reading over her shoulder, grinned. You see catalyst. Judith shook her head in mock despair, but couldn't suppress her smile. You're impossible. You're inspiring, Margaret countered, tapping the screen. Later that night, in a private moment, Judith sat with Thomas's battered cap in her hands. Turning it over slowly, the journey had never been about the clothes, or the class, or even the title. It had always been about the choice to truly see the humanity in each person, regardless of the wrapping. She placed the cap gently on the side table, folded her hands, and prepared herself for the new chapter she hadn't asked for, but would meet head-on. Tomorrow would bring hearings, decisions, debates. But tonight, Judith Winters allowed herself a moment of peace, because sometimes the most powerful revolutions didn't begin with anger. They began with patience, persistence, and a quiet refusal to look away. 3 days later, Washington, D.C. pulsed under a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or shine. Gray clouds boiled overhead, casting deep shadows across the marble steps of the Supreme Court. Inside, the air was cooler, heavier, filled with the scent of polished wood, old paper, and the humming tension of a building that shaped the country's future word by word. Judith Winters moved quietly through the corridors, her soft-soled shoes making little sound on the stone floors. She wore her judicial robes for the first time since the flight, the heavy black fabric brushing against her calves. A weight she welcomed. It was a uniform. Yes, but it was armor too, not against the world, but for it. At the end of a narrow hallway, a security officer opened the door to her chambers with a nod of deference. Judith stepped inside, taking a moment to absorb the sight, the high ceilings, the towering bookshelves lined with legal tomes and old precedents, the view beyond the windows where the Capitol dome stood proud against the stormy sky. But the first thing her eyes found, instinctively, was the small wooden side table. And there, placed deliberately where she would always see it, was Thomas's battered Yale cap, a reminder, a promise. Judith crossed to the desk where a slim, neatly stacked file waited briefing materials for an upcoming case on workplace discrimination. She leafed through the opening pages, her heart catching slightly when she read the first sentence. The appearance standards imposed by employers must not become a proxy for racial, socioeconomic, or gender discrimination. The irony was almost too perfect. She heard a knock at the open door and looked up to find one of her new clerks, a young woman named Priya, standing nervously on the threshold. "Justice Winters," she said, voice wobbling just slightly. "I thought you might want to see this." She handed over a thick bundle of printouts, news articles, op-eds, university statements. Judith flipped through them quickly, noting the headlines: "Appearance Bias, America's Silent Prejudice." "First-Class Justice, Why Titles Don't Tell the Full Story." From airport to courtroom, Judith Winters and the face of modern dignity. Across the country, her quiet confrontation on the flight had sparked not just conversation, but movement. Universities were launching new courses on implicit bias. Companies were scrambling to revise internal policies. Civil rights groups were citing the incident in lobbying efforts for stronger anti-discrimination legislation. A quiet revolution was unfurling, not led by shouting protests, but by whispered realizations blooming in classrooms, boardrooms, and family kitchens. Judith looked up at Priya and smiled warmly. "Thank you," she said. "Would you stay a moment?" Priya blinked, surprised, but nodded and entered. Judith gestured for her to sit across the desk. "I understand you've been organizing a study group outside your official clerk duties," she said. "Discussions about equity, bias, inclusion." Priya flushed. "I hope that's all right, ma'am. We wanted to understand better everything that's happening." Judith leaned back, studying her. Young, brilliant, unjaded, exactly the kind of mind the system needed and too often chewed up. "I don't just think it's all right," Judith said. "I think it's necessary." Priya's shoulders visibly relaxed, the tension melting away. "I'd like to support it," Judith continued. "Not formally, it would be inappropriate for a sitting justice to advocate too directly, but I can offer guidance, resources, a few quiet conversations." Priya's eyes widened, and Judith saw there the beginning of something beautiful, not just admiration, but commitment. "Thank you," Priya whispered. "We want to make a difference." Judith smiled. "Then start small. Question your assumptions. Challenge your friends. Make people uncomfortable kindly, but firmly. Change doesn't begin with court orders. It begins with moments." Later that afternoon, a small ceremony was held in the main hall, not for Judith alone, but for several newly appointed clerks across the court system. Normally, these gatherings were quiet affairs, attended by families and a handful of dignitaries. Today, the room was packed. Students, professors, lawyers, journalists, people who had, in some way, been touched by the story of a woman in a baseball cap, reminding a nation that dignity wore no uniform. The Chief Justice himself gave the opening remarks, his voice resonant and steady. "We are not here today merely to celebrate appointments," he said. "We are here to reaffirm a principle that justice does not look a certain way, or speak a certain way, or dress a certain way. Justice lives stubbornly, gloriously in the everyday acts of courage we often fail to notice. When he finished, Judith found herself called unexpectedly to the front, an impromptu honor she had neither sought nor particularly wanted. She moved forward slowly, aware of every gaze, every camera hidden among the crowd. Standing behind the podium, she took a breath. "I am honored to serve," she said, keeping her voice low, forcing the audience to lean in. "But I am more honored by what I have seen outside these walls in recent days." She glanced around the room, anchoring herself in the faces young and old, skeptical and hopeful. Change often begins not with grand gestures, but with small moments of decency, a door held open, a seat offered, a judgment withheld. A pause. "Justice, Sue," she said, "begins with seeing." That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. The applause was respectful, restrained, but Judith felt something deeper underneath it. Not celebrity, not even admiration, recognition. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, Carter Williams found her near the exit. He looked slightly stunned, wearing a new suit that didn't quite fit yet, his tie knotted too tight. "Justice Winters," he said breathlessly, "I just wanted to thank you again." The panel went incredible. Your words, they shifted the room. Students are starting projects. Professors are rewriting syllabi. People are listening. Judith smiled. "I'm proud of you." "Carter." He blushed. "I'm just trying to do the right thing." Judith touched his shoulder lightly. "That's harder than it sounds. Don't stop." He nodded, eyes bright, and she watched him melt back into the crowd, the next generation already moving forward. That night, in the privacy of her chambers, Judith sat by the tall windows, the city lights glittering in the distance like 1,000 unsent letters. On her desk sat a framed note, recently delivered by Courier Anonymous, written in careful script. "You reminded me that who I am matters more than what I wear. Thank you, a stranger from Flight 1867. Judith closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet swell around her. She had not asked for this journey. She had not sought to become a symbol, but sometimes history did not need willing participants. It needed witnesses willing to stand when the world looked away. Tomorrow, there would be cases to hear, opinions to write, dissents to deliver. Tomorrow, she would don her robes and face a courtroom that still carried its own ghosts of exclusion. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be a woman, a widow, a justice, a human being who had once been mistaken for less and chosen to reveal, through grace, that she had always been more. Weeks passed, and the first sharp edges of public attention dulled into something quieter, but no less profound a movement not of headlines, but of habits. Judith Winters returned to the work she had always known: case conferences, opinion drafts, intense deliberations behind closed doors. But the air around her had changed. Everywhere she turned, there were small signs, as subtle and resilient as wildflowers breaking through concrete. It began inside the court itself. Clerks across different chambers, even those traditionally wary of change, formed informal discussion groups around implicit bias. Justice Harrington's office quietly circulated a memo encouraging the review of hiring and onboarding practices, urging a more conscious approach to mentorship and inclusion. It wasn't revolution, it was evolution. And Judith, though she moved through it all with the same measured grace as before, felt the current running faster beneath her feet. One morning, as she made her way into the justice's private conference room, she passed Justice Ramirez, a respected senior member of the bench. Ramirez, who had been known for his gruffness and skepticism, paused in the hallway. "Winters," he said, his voice a low rumble, "saw your speech, saw what followed." Judith waited, sensing there was more. Ramirez cleared his throat awkwardly. "My granddaughter, she's in high school, wrote a paper about you. Title was, 'Justice Isn't Always in a Robe.'" His mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Judith smiled softly. "She sounds like a smart young woman." Ramirez grunted. "Yeah, smarter than her old man. That's for sure." He nodded once. brusque, and continued on. But Judith stood frozen for a moment longer, feeling the impact ripple out in quiet, unseen way. Beyond the court's marble columns, the country shifted too. Airlines, wary of the reputational firestorm still burning months later, began publicly rolling out new training modules designed not just to tick legal boxes but to interrogate deeper prejudices. Retailers launched employee campaigns framed around dignity, first customer service. Some cities even proposed pilot programs integrating appearance discrimination into civil rights protections. It was incremental, imperfect, messy. It was real. Meanwhile, Richard Townsend's story unfolded like a slow-motion collapse on the outer edges of public interest. His name had become synonymous with arrogance, a case study in corporate law, seminars about the cost of invisible cruelty exposed. He formally withdrew from Westmore for Peace, American Workers, citing unavoidable conflicts of interest. And though the firm issued sterile statements about mutual partings, the truth was obvious. His future before the Supreme Court was over. News trickled in that Townsend had relocated to a small college in Ohio, teaching legal ethics to undergraduates, a sharp, humbling pivot from the corridors of federal power. His fall wasn't vindicated by Judith. She had never spoken against him. He had destroyed himself with his own actions, in front of witnesses who had simply refused to look away. As for Heather Reynolds, the flight attendant, who had once wielded subtle disdain with the ease of muscle memory, her story took a quieter but stranger turn. Through back channels, Judith learned that Heather had volunteered, almost anonymously, to assist with bias awareness programs for at-risk youth in Baltimore. No cameras, no interviews, just long, uncomfortable hours spent listening to people she would have once dismissed without thought. Judith didn't seek her out. She didn't need to. Change, if it was real, didn't require applause. One afternoon, as summer leaned heavy into Washington, Judith was scheduled to deliver remarks at a private symposium hosted by the American Bar Association. The theme was ethics, equity, and evolution. A polished event, suits and law partners and consultants nodding at each other over tiny cups of espresso. But when Judith rose to the podium, something rare stirred through the room, a silence that was not expectant, but reverent. She didn't speak of legal frameworks or precedents. She spoke of assumptions. She spoke of really seeing the dignity in those the world trained us to overlook. She spoke of the day an airline crew and its passengers revealed, unwittingly, that appearances could still blind even the well-educated, the well-intentioned. Bias does not shout, she said. It whispers, it suggests, it assumes, and unless we are vigilant, it becomes the lens through which we render verdicts long before any evidence has been presented. Afterward, there was polite applause, but outside the formalities, real conversations ignited in corridors. Over hurried coffee breaks, young lawyers approached her not for photos, but for book recommendations, for guidance, for mentorship. She noticed Carter Williams hovering near the back of the room, dressed more confidently now. His tie finally loose at the collar instead of strangling him. He waited until the crowd thinned, then approached with a notebook clutched in one hand. "Justice Winters," he said, would you consider co-sponsoring a mentorship initiative with Georgetown Law?" Judith tilted her head, intrigued. "Tell me more." Carter's words tumbled out, unpracticed but passionate. "A program pairing students with judges, clerks, public defenders, not just for internships, but for real conversations about class, about appearance, about the hidden currents beneath the law." Judith smiled not politely, but warmly, genuinely. "Draft a proposal," she said. "Send it to my clerk, Priya. Let's see what we can build." Carter's grin could have lit the entire symposium hall. And in that small exchange, so casual, so easy to overlook, Judith recognized the beginning of her next battle. Not from the bench, from the margins, where the next generation waited, restless and ready. Later that evening, back in her chambers, she found a letter tucked among her papers, handwritten, no signature. The letter read, "I judged you that day on Flight 1867. I thought you didn't belong. I was wrong. I'm trying to see better now. Thank you for your patience when I had none. Judith folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer alongside Thomas's cap. Mistakes were inevitable. It was what came after the hard, unglamorous work of seeing, acknowledging, growing that mattered. That night, she walked alone around the Supreme Court Plaza, the air thick with heat and the smell of damp stone. Above her, the facade of the court glowed under spotlights, equal justice under law, words carved in marble, aspirations, not guarantees. But tonight, they felt closer. Not because the world had changed overnight, because enough people had chosen to begin. Judith tilted her face toward the heavy summer stars and allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to hope not in the power of robes or rulings, but in the slow, stubborn courage of ordinary people refusing, day after day, to look away. The late summer sun melted across Washington in long golden streams as Judith Winters prepared for her final hearing before the court's summer recess. The calendar said the year was half over. In truth, Judith felt as if it had only just begun, or perhaps that she had only just begun. She adjusted her robe carefully, smoothing the heavy fabric with steady hands. There was something almost sacred in the ritual. Now the small preparations before stepping into a place where history lived not in grand speeches, but in patient, relentless argument. A soft knock sounded at her door. Priya, her ever-diligent clerk, poked her head inside. "They're ready for you." "Justice?" Judith gave a nod, rose, and gathered the day's notes. On top of the pile sat a slim, worn folder, the case that had captured national attention. Andrew's farm. Hawthorne Holdings, a lawsuit challenging corporate appearance standards alleged to systematically discriminate against employees based on race, gender, and socioeconomic background. The country had followed the case breathlessly. Commentators called it the natural extension of the movement Judith had unwillingly ignited months ago aboard Flight 1867. She wasn't blind to the symbolism, but symbolism meant nothing without rigor. She crossed the marble floor of the court's private corridor, her footsteps deliberate, calm, behind her. History gathered like a storm. The courtroom was full, not just the usual spectators, law students, interns, curious tourists, but activists, journalists, professors, and ordinary citizens who had found their way here not because they studied law, but because they lived it. Judith took her seat beside her fellow justices. Chief Justice Harrington glanced at her once a silent nod before calling the session to order. The case began. Arguments flowed, sharp and sometimes brutal. Counsel for Hawthorne Holdings defended appearance codes as necessary for client-facing industries, couching discrimination in the language of branding and professionalism. Judith listened intently, her face impassive. Yet as she turned the arguments over in her mind, she thought of all the invisible judgments passed in offices, courtrooms, airports, judgments never spoken aloud, but heavy enough to crush futures. When it was her turn to question the counsel, she leaned forward, her voice measured but unmistakably pointed. "Counsel," she said, "can you define for this court what constitutes professional appearance?" The attorney hesitated, already sensing the trap. "Your Honor, it depends on industry standards." Judith cut in gently. "And who establishes those standards?" "Typically, the management team, based on client expectations." "And are those expectations objective?" She pressed. "Or are they influenced by subjective biases regarding race, gender, and class?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. The attorney floundered, citing statistics that rang hollow against the heavy, listening silence of the court. Judith asked no further questions. She didn't need to. The seeds had been planted. When the session adjourned hours later, the justices filed back into their chambers. Judith paused briefly on the steps outside, letting the heat of the day soak into her bones. She felt no triumph, no adrenaline, only a steady, growing certainty that the battle would be longer than a single ruling, perhaps longer than her own lifetime, but it would be fought. Across the plaza, A small group of law students lingered, debating fiercely under the shade of the columns. Judith spotted Carter among them, animated and passionate, his hands slicing through the air as he made a point. Priya was there too, laughing openly, something Judith realized she hadn't seen from her before. A loosening, a blooming. Judith smiled to herself and moved on. That evening, her chambers were quiet but not empty. On her desk sat a single envelope, cream-colored and unmarked. Inside was an invitation keynote speaker, Georgetown Law's annual public service forum. The topic, the future of justice beyond appearances. No accident, no coincidence. She would accept. Judith leaned back in her chair, letting the heavy silence embrace her. The windows were open, and the hum of the city drifted up sirens, laughter, the low growl of distant traffic. She thought about Margaret, recovering steadily in Chicago, sending updates about her physical therapy sessions and gossipy tidbits from her apartment building. She thought about Heather Reynolds, who had written a letter through a mutual contact, thanking her for forcing me to confront who I had become. She thought about Richard Townsend, now a footnote in law journals, his arrogance buried under the slow, relentless sediment of reform. Mostly, she thought about the millions of invisible moments happening across the country, a hiring manager pausing to reconsider a bias, a teacher recognizing a student's worth beyond neat clothes, a flight attendant offering a real smile without calculation, not miracles, choices. One by one, Judith pulled open her desk drawer and took out Thomas's Yale cap. She turned it over in her hands, the frayed threads catching the light. For a moment, she imagined him sitting across from her, grinning in that lopsided way he always had when she worried too much. "You were never meant to be invisible," she imagined him saying. The thought made her laugh quietly. She placed the cap back gently and closed the drawer. There was a knock at the door. Priya again. Tentative. "Justice Winters. Sorry, I know it's late. I just thought you should see this." Judith waved her in. Priya held out a tablet, her eyes bright with excitement. On the screen, a breaking news alert. Senate introduces Appearance Discrimination Protection Bill. It was the first real step legislation crafted not from a singular scandal, but from a growing recognition that dignity required legal muscle to defend. Judith read the brief article twice, feeling something lift inside her. Not pride, exactly, but a fierce, almost maternal protectiveness over the fragile thing growing in the world because she had refused to bow her head and stay silent. "Thank you, Priya," she said. After the clerk left, Judith stood by the window, looking out at the glowing spine of the National Mall. The Capitol dome gleamed against the velvet dusk. Stubborn and brilliant, the future would not be easy. Change never was. But she had seen enough, suffered enough, endured enough to know that slow was not the same as impossible. She would continue to listen, continue to question, continue to see. Justice, true justice, was not blind. It saw everything, the flaws, the failures, the heartbreak, and still chose to hope, still chose to believe, still chose to act. As night settled over the city, Judith Winters turned off the lights, letting the darkness gather around her without fear. Tomorrow, the fight would continue. Tomorrow, and every day after, and she would be ready.